Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Aspiring Entrepreneur. I'm your host, Hamza Chowdhury, and welcome to today a new series that I'm going to launch on real estate, helping you guys, whether you're a homeowner, whether you're a renter, whether you're someone who's a developer. As you guys know, I'm a licensed structural engineer in the state of California, and I do run a business which is HC Structural Engineering. I've had it for about 12 years, and what I'd like to do in this series and through these videos is help you guys sort of understand structures. And a lot of our clients obviously pay a lot of money to us for this advice. And I'm actually going to offer this advice completely free. I'm going to help you guys in this episode talk specifically about decks. All I ask in return for this video and for this time is just to please hit the like and subscribe to this channel. As always, guys, we're a 100% free content channel, and our whole sort of channel is built on your support. And so I appreciate if you do that. As always, guys, if you have any questions or comments in general about structural, feel free to post it below. I hope that you'll find this video useful. And so one of the things that happened recently in Florida is we know that the condo collapsed. And structures, especially specifically wood structures, are very common in the States. And so what we should know is that a lot of structures built, a lot of structures, at least specifically where I'm located in the Bay Area, are, anywhere from 50 to 100 years old. And we have to understand that, a lot of the materials aren't necessarily a lifetime, right? I mean, not everything's going to be like a Parthenon or a historic structure like a pyramid. A lot of structures are built with wood, and wood primarily as a material isn't necessarily a life long type of material. It typically can have anywhere between a 5, 10, 20-year shelf life if it's essentially, exterior used. And if it's an interior, like a stud, like your walls, that you can't essentially see the wood, obviously it lasts a lot longer because it's protected in some type of shell and some type of environment from moisture damage. And so the point of this video really specifically is to talk about decks, and I want you to kind of understand sort of what we see in decks and what's involved. And so the first picture I want to pull out here is a deck that I just saw, just a couple days ago. And what I want to focus on for you guys is sort of breaking down what specifically a structural engineer is looking for when we're analyzing a deck. And so the first thing we're looking at here is the actual guardrail. Okay, the guardrail is what basically prevents you from falling over. And so whether you're elevated at an 8-foot deck, a 100-foot deck, whatever deck you're looking at, the guardrail is really there for you to be able to lean on, to put your plate on if you're socializing outside, whatever the case is. And so one of the things that you want to do is look at the height of your guardrail. And traditionally back in the 70s, the code allowed 36 inches, which is essentially 3 feet of a guardrail. And so that was, for someone like me who's 6 feet, I could tell when I'm in a 36-inch guardrail because it feels very low. And so the ability to sort of tip over and to fall over is a lot higher. And so the code changed to allow 42 inches, which, that additional 6 inches is really sort of a big deal. And so what you have from the top of the rail to the top of the floor is a 42-inch guardrail. That is something that means you're to code. If it's something less, you may want to consider adding some type of bar or some type of rail on top of your guardrail, just so you can add that additional protection and protect yourself from any liability if you have any renters. Another thing I like to talk about is the connection. Okay, a lot of times you may notice that your guardrail is quite loose, and so you have people leaning on it. Maybe you've pushed and you realize like, hey, this thing is loosing. And a lot of times it's because, again, we're using screws and wood tends to soften over time. And if you keep pushing on the rail, of course, you're going to start to create what we call like some type of slippage between the screw and the guardrail. And so one of the things that you can do, and what we like to do, is install what we call a Simpson sort of hold down. And a hold down device is basically something that connects the joist side, which is this underside of the deck, to the actual post. And so when you have some type of hold down device from Simpson Strong Tie, which is the company that I'd recommend, you basically tie anytime you want to yank on the actual guardrail, you actually are pulling the actual joist, which is this wood piece supporting the floor. Okay, and so having some type of hardware and connector that connects your joist and your post, as you try to push the post out, you're actually trying to drag this as well, and so it pretty much locks it in. Now again, the lag screw connection is very standard, very popular, but it's not a desirable connection because ideally longer term you will have that loosening effect. And so anchoring this with these proper hold downs that you can find at your local hardware store will definitely prevent this guardrail from loosening up, obviously maintaining the right height. And one of the codes too is that you have to have no more than 4 inches between the spindles. Now why is that? the building code basically recommends that you don't have no more than 4 inches between spindles so that a baby's head can't fit through the holes. And so now a lot of people, you may see 8 inches, 6 inches. And so there's a potential for someone to slip through the rail, and that's a liability. And so from all directions, whether it's underneath the rail or in between the spindles, you have to make sure that there's no more than 4 inches clearance between the spindles so that a baby's head, nobody can go through the spindle. Okay. And so the next thing I want to talk about is essentially the rot. Okay. And a lot of times wood in general rots. And like I mentioned earlier in this video, it wasn't meant to be a lifelong material. And so if you have dry rot, if you see damage to your wood, you see some type of flaking off, potentially you might even have termite damage, make sure you replace that. Now, it doesn't have to be engineered. It could be pretty much the same size and shape and grade of the existing species. But the key here is that you don't want a post that is half rotten, half supported on the ground that's transferring, right? All of this weight's being transferred into the ground, and half of it can't be transferred because essentially it's been rotten away. And so one of the things that you want to do is sort of a annual visual inspection of your deck. See if you see any dry rot, any type of rust, any problems potentially with your deck, and think about replacing it in kind, same size, same shape, same grade, same species of wood, just to prevent the dry rot from expanding. Okay. And of course, you know, this is something that's very common. And again, why is that? Because sometimes, you know, maybe you don't have pressure treated, maybe you don't have redwood or cedar. And so what you want to find is a piece of wood that is naturally resistant to moisture damage. And so when we say pressure treated wood, or you may hear Douglas fir, you know, pressure treated, whatever grade of wood is available in your area, the reason why we say pressure treated is it is basically it's indented, right? If you see pressure treated wood and you see those indentations, you see those holes, essentially there are injections of chemicals, right, that go into this wood that allow it to be, you know, essentially injected to prevent that moisture damage. Okay. And so the reason why we call it pressure treated is we inject it with chemicals to prevent that type of rot damage and things like that that you get with moisture. Okay. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And hopefully, you know, that advice is helpful. Another thing too, specifically, are the connections that you have. Do you have proper connections from your deck joists, which are the wood pieces supporting your floor of your deck, going into some type of beam? As you can see here, this is really an odd connection. And this is actually from a real inspection that I recently did. And so imagine you have a double 2x joist. Okay, this is a joist that's supporting your floor, but look what it's connecting to. Okay, this right here is a metal piece. It's basically a connector. And so this is connecting into this. But the odd thing about it is, why is this thing, which is made up of 2 pieces of 2x8, connecting to a single piece of 2x8, right? There's a hierarchy. When you connect X to Y or Y to Z, you're expecting the Y or the Z to be essentially a bigger, heftier, beefier member. And in this case, you have a double 2x8 connected to a single 2x8. Okay, and so this right here tells me that this was not properly designed. And a lot of times you can see when something's not properly designed because of what? You see a sag. And so if you look out your deck and you feel like a bounce, or you can see visually that there's a sag, most likely there's a good chance that your header, that your member, that your beam that's supporting the weight of your deck is not sufficiently designed. And so this is where you want to consult a structural engineer to get this properly designed. You can also see here that we also have a lot of rot. You can also see that everything is toe-nailed. Okay, in California, we're specifically a earthquake area. Okay, there's a lot of earthquakes in this area. And so one of the things that you don't want to do is have connections that are essentially nailed together. What I always tell clients is, imagine if you and I took a piece of wood, we toe-nailed it together, and then we play tug of war. What happens? The 2 members split, because nails don't have what we call withdrawal value. They have no value in terms of being able to hold 2 pieces together if you were essentially pulling them in tension, pulling them apart. And so these types of connections are very poor. They're very common back before the 70s, before residential really engineering was discovered. And so a lot of people, especially even in the Bay Area and California, have toe-nailed connections which aren't really recognized in code. And so a lot of times what you want to look for here is some type of retrofit bracket, some type of retrofit post bracket, or even some type of angle bracket that you can get at your local hardware store to connect the beam and the post. Okay, and so by using, let's say for example, an angle bracket, you've connected 2 pieces of wood together so that they can work together against each other. Okay, right now you can see these 2 nails that are popping in are basically right? Let me just zoom in here. You can see these 2 nails. They're not going to do anything. They're not going to provide you with any type of value, okay? And so you can see that you're going to want to properly connect your beam and to your post, okay? And so that's one of the things that we look for as structural engineers, is how are things connected in the load flow. So I go from the joist into the header. The header now takes that weight and goes into the post, and then the post takes it to the ground, into the foundation, okay? And so, you know, this specific construction, I thought there was a lot of good things I also saw on the deck that I wanted to mention. This specifically is, you may ask, well, what's this? This is what we call a ledger. And so if you look at the connection from the deck into the structure, one of the things that happens in earthquakes is what? You have a bunch of racking, right? This idea that your house is going back and forth. Well, what if your deck is not properly connected to the house? What does it do, right? It wants to essentially tear apart. It wants to rip away from the structure. It doesn't want to go along for the ride because it's not properly connected into the structure. It essentially detaches itself, and then maybe in some cases your house may end up pushing it and knocking it out in itself. And so one of the things that you want to do is you want to connect what we call a ledger board, which is just a piece of wood, onto the structure. And what we did in this case is, this is actually a piece of steel, okay? So this is a piece of steel going across a carport, and what they did is they actually anchored the deck into this piece of steel, so that, guess what, the steel is actually going to be preventing this thing from essentially ripping out of the structure. And so think of this piece of steel as possibly your house, and it could be the main wall of your house. By connecting this piece of wood into the structure with proper connections, like in this case, there's some type of anchor bolt, okay, or we talked about a hold down device. Basically, it's going to prevent this thing from ripping out of your house, okay? So you want to have a ledger board, you want to use screws when you connect the ledger board into the house, and then you also want to add hold down hardware every 4 feet minimum, so that when your house or when your deck wants to rip out of your house, guess what? The hold downs are going to prevent this thing from coming back. Now, do the screws help? Yes, they do. Screws have withdrawal values. So the screws are also going to help the ledger and the deck from ripping out of the house. Okay. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And, you know, again, look at the dry rot. Look at the dry rot between your deck joists and make sure that you replace this in kind. As you can see, this one deck joist is completely gone. And as you can see, it's framing again to something we mentioned, which was smaller. Okay. And so again, guys, you know, a lot of things to keep in mind when you're framing a deck. You can look at the dry rot. You can look at what you're supported on. But one of the things like I would encourage you guys to do is to make sure that your post, which is essentially supporting, you know, on a piece of concrete, is connected into the concrete, and it's not just sitting on a piece of wood. And so in this case, you can see that there's this piece of wood, there is a post base, and so this is a connector that connects the two, but you can see it's sitting on wood, and that's not what we want to see. What we want to see is a square piece of concrete which has a connector embedded, which means it was poured inside with the concrete, sticking out, so that when the post sits in the concrete on this post base, it's connected directly to the concrete. Okay, so let me say this again. We want to see this piece of metal here, which is the post base connector. We want to see this embedded inside the concrete before they pour it, so that when they pour it, this essentially acts as one piece. It connects the post and the concrete together, rather than have this thing sit on some type of wood. Obviously, this thing can get knocked out much easier. By having it in a connector, in a type of a metal connector, it basically makes it a better, more secure connection, and also prevents it from what, right? If someone were to hit it, it has a lot more ability to withdraw and to not have to move and slide and be damaged than compared to if someone to just to knock this off if this was just sitting on wood. And so a lot of times we want to see the post embedded with the concrete. If it's pressure treated, yeah, you can actually embed it in the concrete without the post based connector, but that's just a lot harder because obviously you have to have the post stand up straight before you pour the concrete. And a lot of times people just want to pour the concrete, they want to have the connector just sitting there in the concrete, and then they want to come back and put the post. If you have any questions on that, again, feel free to post it. Here you can see again the beam and the post aren't properly connected. This whole connection can slip, and believe me, I've seen my fair amount of connections that have slipped, where a beam again is racking back and forth in an earthquake, and you can imagine this is supporting the deck joist and it's not properly connected. Now it could be toe-nailed, whatever the case is. This thing, what's going to prevent this thing from slipping off of this post, the support? And so again, by adding, let's say, an angle here at the bottom of the joist and on the side of the post, if you added, let's say, an angle, right, you can attach it, adding a strap, adding some type of connector, some type of, we talked about a post connector at the top. which basically hugs the two elements together. And so there's several ways that we can actually look at this, but we don't want to just nail this thing together, because again, we talked about how nails are going to slip. Okay. One of the things that we see a lot too are splices. Okay. Splices are essentially two pieces of wood, right, that are just spliced. Instead of one continuous piece of wood, you just have two pieces of wood that come together. In this case, again, it's all nailed together, so nothing's going to prevent these things from slipping. And so imagine again in an earthquake, when you're doing this and you're racking the deck, what's going to happen with these beams? These beams aren't going to work together. They're not going to go side to side together because they're not even connected. These two beams aren't even connected. They're two separate beams, but they're connected to the same post. So by adding what we call a strap, a horizontal strap, it could be a CS16 strap if you're using Simpson Strong Tie, an MST strap, any type of metal strap that gets nailed to both sides of this is now going to put what we call continuity. It's going to put a continuity between the beams. And so what we want to see is some type of strap to essentially what? This is a weak spot. It's a splice. So the strap makes the continuity occur. Okay. And so think about earthquakes and winds as forces that create left and right, right? They go left and right. They don't go up and down necessarily, right? So gravity, your weight, it goes up and down. That's gravity weight, but we're talking about earthquake weights, things that are pushing your structure left and right. And so when your structure starts to shake, we're trying to prevent things from splitting apart. Okay. So adding a strap is going to prevent that from happening. Okay. And so again, ledger board connections, making sure that once we have our ledger connected to the house, that our deck joists are connected properly. And again, nails are not the proper way to connect. Everything used to be just nailed back into the ledger. Guys, what's going to prevent this joist from ripping out of the ledger? So again, we want to add metal connectors, metal hangers, an angle, right? Anything that's going to connect these two elements is a connector. And we just want to use a connection, some type of light gauge metal connection to connect the two elements. We don't want to simply just toenail stuff, because we know that toenails will just slip in an earthquake. Okay. And then the same thing here is, you may say, well, what's wrong with this picture? It's sitting on a beam. Well, yeah, but what's going to prevent this beam and these joists from sliding, right? They can still slide on this beam. So we have a beam here that's supporting the deck joist. What's going to prevent these joists from sliding on top of this beam and just swaying on top of it, right? You can say, well, there's friction. Yeah, there's friction, but you don't want to depend on friction when you're looking at essentially a sway in the structure. And so what we do here is we typically add blocking. What's blocking? It's just a piece of wood that goes in between two other pieces of wood. Okay. And so if you have joist coming out of this page, right? Essentially it's just a piece of wood that goes in between these two pieces of wood. And now guess what? It can't move because it's essentially locked in. And so we call it blocking, but just think of it as it's just really pieces of wood that just go in between the existing wood that prevent it from what? Sliding. Okay. And so that's what this picture is missing, is it's missing a piece of block in between these two joists. Okay. And so again, these are measures that you could take to protect your deck, protect your investment. And with that said, guys, as always, we will have a ton of other videos on foundations and things like that. I did want to kick off this series talking about decks. If you have any specific questions about your decks, feel free to post them below. As always, guys, if you did enjoy this video, do hit the like and subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.